Hey everyone, this is the River Hoopoe, and this is the first video in a series on how you should be building your commander decks. This one will go over the basics of card evaluation and start looping those into deck building and deck building intent for future videos. With that all out of the way, let's get straight to the point. Why do new players play such bad Magic cards? I've been trying to explain it to them over and over for 5 years now, but if I get it on video, I get to stop explaining it. Whether you're one of those new players and wondering why everyone else plays so much more Magic than you, or a veteran like me sifting through a deck list you don't even know how to fix, I think I can help. I have a lot of experience teaching new players this game, and as a friend of mine used to say, friends don't let friends run catalog. The most common answers given to this question are that either those players lack the awareness of good cards, or the experience necessary to identify what's important. The latter of these is self-evident to anyone who has tried to explain that fetch lands are in fact the most powerful cards in the game, only to be given a blank stare or get frustrated, as the person they're talking to has no reference to what they are talking about. However, these reasons only explain why they don't play good cards. They don't explain why they play such bad ones, which is the point of the video. An illuminating example of the difference was a situation that I was in that inspired this script. For some scene setting, I run a Discord for a local college. It's very cool, very popular. This means that every semester or so, I get a crop of new people flooding in. They ask me basic questions, not only about the local scene, but about the game itself. Side note here, I understand answering these questions is kind of an endless task. Most of these people have only played the game very poorly with their friends at home, or are completely new. In fact, answering their questions is kind of one of the reasons that I decided to make this channel. With that tangent over, recently, one of these new players said they really liked Ruby Daring Tracker for their 5-color Dragons deck. Ruby's basically a 2-mana Gruul mana dork. They even had fairly sound logic. They know Llanowar Elves is a very playable Magic card, and this is a Llanowar Elves with haste and tapping for an additional color. Now notice this refutes our earlier explanation. This player is very much aware of the existence of good cards such as Llanowar Elves, and they are aware of why it's good that it taps for mana, but they have failed to recognize why it's the inferior card. With this discrepancy, we can find the answer to our question. As an experienced player would respond that being 2 mana of 2 different colors, Ruby isn't on rate. A phrase that means nothing to a new player and explains even less. A phrase that this video will hopefully educate you guys on. For starters, let us define the phrase. It means a card's effect is in line with what is expected at its cost. For some clarity, here are some examples showing that cost is not just amount of mana, but the colors of the mana and additional things such as discarding or sacrificing. While these rates are good benchmarks to measure cards, they are by no means set in stone. They slowly change as WotC pursues their endless goal to print more cardboard. Additionally, this is not the best version of an effect. This is the minimum viable version for the format you're brewing for. To learn how to use this tool, let's go back to Ruby. The rate that WotC has established for a green creature that taps for 1 mana is 1 green. How do we know this? Well, here's a million versions of it. And here's even more versions of it. In fact, this is one of the most well-established rates in the history of Magic the Gathering. Ruby even acknowledges this rate by having additional abilities, that being the haste and this conditional buff, to justify its higher cost. A small clue that WotC doesn't consider this card to be worth the cardboard that it's printed on is all of these abilities begging you to play it. However, you will note that we still haven't refuted the logic from our player from a few minutes ago. This creature immediately taps for mana, which can pseudo-discount Ruby by 1. That would return us to having a reasonable rate for its cost. The solution for this is knowing the rate of a multitude of effects, which is essential for holistically evaluating a card within a deck. In this instance, knowing the rate for an artifact that immediately taps for mana is also 2, gives us the context we need. So, instead of comparing Ruby to Llanowar elves, we should be comparing it to Arcane Signet, which offers far better fixing. Additionally, this draws attention to Ruby's creature typing, which then allows us to have our new player acknowledge that creatures are inherently vulnerable to board wipes and removal, and whether that downside is worth playing it over something more resilient, like an artifact, or even better yet, a land. This helps train their focus on whether or not that typing, or this buff, is important to their deck. In this particular case, Ruby's a mana dork. She's not attacking. Why would we need a buff? Additionally, she's not a dragon, and creature typing is just getting her swept up in the Blasphemous Act. So, we're axing it there too. No greater context or game experience needed. Just knowing the rates of different effects and understanding what this particular deck is trying to do. The key here is to see that deviation from the on-rate version and decide whether or not that deviation is a positive for your game plan, irrelevant, or even worse, detrimental when determining whether or not you should run a given effect. Thus far, I hope I've demonstrated how to use this tool and why it's important. But I also understand that I failed to really give sufficient info to make it worthwhile or even really useful. Cards don't say on them, I'm on rate, or I'm bulk bin trash. Though, in the past, I have legitimately told new players to only run rare cards. This has not yielded good decks, but it has been very funny. To let you skip that step, I'm just going to give you the rate, a bunch of generic effects, and some examples for them. To begin, we're going to finish off the ramp section, since we're already so deep. We already covered, for green creatures, it's 1 mana in and 1 mana back. Additionally, we already went through artifacts. 2 mana should buy you an untapped rock that produces 1 mana of at least 1 color, hopefully more. Finally, fetching a land to the battlefield should cost you 2 mana, only for green though. Remember, this typing is important for how likely it is for your mana to stick around throughout the entire game. Another thing to note here is that effects are expected to scale more than linearly for every metric I'm about to list. That is to say that 2 mana for 1 land is totally fine, perfectly playable. 6 mana for 3 lands though, incredibly mediocre. This is because the effects you're competing with at 2 mana are far lower impact to the game than the ones you're competing with at 6. Moving on to removal, you generally want it to be instant speed to answer a specific problem at a specific time. At 2 mana, these answers will usually be limited in some way, be it card type or other restriction. At 3 mana, they'll hit any card type you want, but it'll probably have some kind of downside. By the time you're hitting 4 mana though, these should be board wipes. They'll be sorcery speed, but they should be dealing with just about everything, so the speed doesn't matter. Though there's a lot of variation depending on the needs of your deck, the colors you are playing, and the exact kinds of answers you're going to see. For rates and types to expect, feel free to pause on this page for each color, because it'll take way too long for me to read through the whole thing. Coming into draw, I have a lot of opinions, but those are going to need to take the form of another video, because this has taken like a week to edit. For now, we're going to use 2 categories. Engines, which should draw you 1 card a turn at 3 mana and multiple cards a turn at 4 mana. And burst effects, which should cost as much as they draw in cards if they're at sorcery speed, and then 1 more if they're at instant speed. For example, a 2 mana sorcery and a 3 mana instant should each draw you 2 cards. Finally, I'm going to leave you with some general rules that you can go by when you're evaluating stuff. Instants and sorceries are a 1 mana change, with the sorceries usually being the cheaper one. Changing between a creature and a non-creature, however, is a little more weird. It depends on whether or not you would generally consider it an advantageous change. Usually, the amount of colored mana a card costs is changed by 1. So, a 3 generic and 1 green card would become a 2 generic and 2 green card, if the change is seen as advantageous. Finally, a card being made multicolor is generally seen as cause for a reduction of 1 to its overall mana value. I will say these are a lot more guidelines than strict rules, but there are some general effects and will hopefully get you started here. Maybe in the future I can go into some archetype specific stuff. Aristocrats has a whole ton that I could break down. Hopefully this is a good initial setup that you can start measuring your synergy pieces and new cards to compete with. To wrap things up, whether you're a new player or greatly experienced in explaining this game, I hope that I've given you a starting line for learning and teaching the skill of card evaluation, giving you a way to create baselines by which you can filter the tens of thousands of cards available in this game, slowly testing out the different nuanced benefits of overcosted cards can get you as you gain game experience. For instance, I've spent the past 10 minutes criticizing Ruby a ton, which is very similar to a card named Rada. But that didn't stop another YouTuber, Salubrious Snail, from making it the center of an entire deck tech based on it being a legendary, allowing it to act as guaranteed ramp on turn 2 in the command zone. This is to say, don't use rate of effect as an excuse to dismiss cards outright, but as a benchmark to make sure you're outperforming. If you do, I think you'll find your average card quality and by proxy, deck performance rise nicely. Thank you everyone for listening. This is my first video. I had to learn how to do auditing software. I recorded this like 10 times because I couldn't figure out how the stupid microphone works. But I hope everyone enjoyed. I look forward to making the future stuff that I mentioned at the top. Really wanted to thank my friends for really telling me to come do this. And yeah, I'm just really excited to start sharing all these stupid rants in my head with the internet. And if you have any suggestions on any topics or cards or setup stuff, I would really appreciate the help. Thank you so much. I'm so nervous I forgot to record myself saying bye.